I'm not.
It is now 6:30, time to call the meeting to order for the City of Oak Harbor's Planning Commission, our regular meeting, and the date is May 22nd, 2018. The roll call this evening, everyone's present except Jess Walker-Wise. Second item on the agenda this evening is the approval of the April 24, 2018 minutes. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
A second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And I abstain.
I abstain.
Okay, the third item is public comment. Planning Commission will accept public comment for items not otherwise on the agenda for the first 15 minutes of the Planning Commission meeting. Do I have any takers?
I'm sorry, not otherwise on the agenda?
Yes.
And the agenda items are at the end.
Well, we have the entire agenda. Did you get a copy of the agenda?
I did, I'm sorry, so I'm just confused, so the items that are on the agenda, if the public wishes to speak, is that as the agenda item?
At the time
Oh.
that we address the agenda item, yes, that's correct. So you have nothing that is not on the agenda?
No.
Okay. Well, seeing no one, we'll close that part of the meeting. Fourth are the public hearings and meetings. The first item is presented by our Associate Planner Ray Lindenberg, Accessory Dwelling Units Ordinance, and it is going to be a public hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission. Tonight, we're going to go through some information that we were able to get from a public survey we did on the accessory dwelling unit question, if you will. And what I'll do is kind of go through just a little bit of background. You already know where we've been with that. We had the three recommendations from the Affordable Housing Task Force for making some revisions to the existing ADU ordinance. Then we had a public outreach and survey that actually, do we have a newer version of the, should be, sorry, there's some information missing there, but I'll go ahead. So what we did is we went through a process that we did an online survey to get some information from the public and the community to determine kind of the other side of the story. We've heard what thank you, that's it. We've heard what the Affordable Housing Task Force gave us and what their recommendations were for our code. And we wanted to kind of get what the attitude of the community was. So what we did is had a survey that we sent out, notice was sent out with our April 20th utility bills. And then we also did some noticing on the Facebook page, on the City of Oak Harbor Facebook page. And we're able to get about, I think we had 96 responses to our survey. So I'm going to go through some of these questions and what we got to kind of give you an idea of where the community attitude is on these ADUs. So the categories of the survey questions kind of broke it down into three different categories there. Kind of a background to identify the awareness of the issue, questions related to the task force recommendations, and then a couple follow-up questions at the end. The first question, kind of most important, well, not most important, but most interesting. Were you aware that accessory dwelling units were previously allowed in the city? I was actually surprised that 21% of people said yes. But I think the reason for that, and that seems like a high number to me, I think the reason for that is people who answer these types of things are probably a little bit more in tune with what's going on in the city. So we had a pretty overwhelming majority of folks that did not know that you could do an ADU in the city, and that's kind of what we expected, honestly. Given that information, kind of a follow-up question, would you be interested in constructing one in your yard or attached to your house? And there are the two different manners in which you can do that. That was split, and that's not too surprising. You know, if you're interested versus whether you're actually going to do it, two completely different things. So if you answered yes on question 2, I would be interested, why would you answer yes? And some of we gave them kind of 4 pre-made answers, and then we also gave the option of entering your own information in, following up there. So the largest category was that it would provide additional income. So people are kind of looking for that additional income. You know, maybe I can pay part of my mortgage with rental income or something like that. Other answers included providing for additional space for a family member, whether or not they live there now. You know, if you have a teenage kid that you want to kind of move out of the house, but not necessarily off the property, versus having, you know, mom or dad come in and move from somewhere else. Some of the other on the yes answers, guest space, home office, just additional living space, things like that were some of the answers that were provided there. If you answered no, why would it be that you wouldn't want to construct an ADU? 31% just not interested, and that's kind of to be expected. Then the largest 2 categories there were at 41%, there's not enough room on my property, which is also kind of unsurprising. We're kind of moving towards smaller lots these days, you know, putting more house onto a smaller lot, so that's not too surprising that people feel like they don't have enough room. And then 41% selected other. And if you'll notice here, when I put these comments in, it says selected comments. That's because we got quite a few of them, and some of them were more helpful than others. I'll just put it that way, in sort of a polite sort of way. But a lot of people were honestly concerned about the impact that an ADU would have on their neighborhood. They were thinking about their neighborhood as a whole. I didn't want to, you know, impose on my neighbors additional traffic and things like that. I moved into this neighborhood because it's a single-family neighborhood, and that's the way I'd like it to be. So those are some of the comments that we got on the no answers for that. And then the follow-on question to that is, would you support your neighbor constructing an accessory dwelling unit? 40% said yes, that they would have no problem as long as it was built to the code standards. Pretty reasonable expectation there. And then 27% at the other end said no, I moved into a single family neighborhood with the expectation that it stay that way. So there's kind of, you know, the extremes on both ends. The kind of middle answers didn't get a lot of comments or a lot of affirmative responses there. We had 11% giving other comments. People concerned about turning neighborhoods into slums, comments about tiny houses and how they are going to fit into the whole ADU situation. And then somebody stating, you know, and it makes sense, we're not talking about one ADU. Maybe you're okay with one neighbor building an ADU, but you're not okay with 6 neighbors building ADUs. So there's kind of that conflict internally with folks. So moving on to the 3 recommendations by Affordable Housing Task Force. The first one was whether or not a parking space should be required on site. We asked, what is your opinion of this requirement? Because the current code requires a parking space. 28% stated that having a parking space specifically for the ADU will ensure that there's always a parking space on site. 18% said not enough street parking, so it should be necessary. And on the other side, there's plenty of street parking, got 18%. And then one space is not enough, there should be more, got almost 15%. And then some other comments as well, and those other comments, talking about people parking multiple cars on the street, not a lot of parking enforcement for people who aren't parking exactly legally, either too close to a stop sign or you know, facing the wrong direction on the street, things like that. Other people talking about should be on a case-by-case basis, which is reasonable but kind of difficult to enforce, and how do you write that out in a code? Somebody said that it shouldn't be a requirement because they want Oak Harbor's government out of their life as much as possible. So there's the, you know, the wild variation there, and it's always interesting to read some of these comments. So how important is it that the ADU ordinance require an off-street parking space? 40% said very important, 24% somewhat important, 13% not important at all, and 14% not very important. I would consider that a pretty strong consensus towards keeping a parking space requirement in the code. Now, the second question, or the second issue that was brought up by the task force was the on-site ownership. Now, This one is a little bit more mixed in its results, I would say. We see kind of an even spread there of the kind of what I call the positive and negative answers on there. We had 2 that were kind of viewed as positive and 2 that were negative. And the thing is, it's extremely difficult to write these questions so that you're not introducing any slant into it. So that's what we try to do as much as possible here by giving folks a couple of different options and then also giving them the other category that they could enter in their own options. And some people said, you know, I felt like 2 and 3 or A and B or whatever. There might have been multiple options that they agreed with. So that was an option as well. So some of the on-site ownership comments. What is the enforcement procedure? We have rental home and the current requirements don't allow us to enjoy the ADU as a vacation home. There's a lot of different feelings, I think, on this one. But when you get to the question, how important is that we have a requirement that the property owner live on site? Again, we get fairly strong correlation that people think that is an important thing to have in our code. We had 59% saying it was either somewhat or very important. So again, you get a lot of kind of back and forth when you ask them kind of the open-ended question, but when you get down to the brass tacks, there's pretty strong support to keep that requirement in there. For the recorded covenant, again, very similar. The quote positive responses got more feedback and more support than the supposed negative answers. So the question there was that should we maintain the recorded covenant, and what is your opinion of that? And the number one answer was that it ensures that future property owners are aware of regulations regarding the ADU. And I think that's a fairly important thing to state, is that not only are we notifying the current owner, but without a covenant requirement, the future owner doesn't necessarily know what those requirements are. Again, some selected comments. You got the one end, just another government intrusion into the freedom of my property, And then at the other end, concur with this requirement, agree with all 4 of the opinions offered. Somebody said it disincentivizes owners to build ADUs. So again, there's kind of that wide variety of opinion. But again, when you get to the yes or no question, should we keep it? Pretty strong support for keeping that option or that requirement in there. So we had a couple of follow-up questions, and one of them that I pointed out in a previous presentation is that the Oak Harbor Code does not have a minimum or a maximum square footage, which was fairly rare or extremely rare among the similar communities that we researched when we were looking into what other communities are doing with their ADU ordinance. If I remember correctly, all of them had a maximum square footage. Oak Harbor doesn't. And so the question was, what is your opinion of this? 36% said it allows a property owner the flexibility to build what they want. 29% said it allows for a larger building that might be out of scale with the neighborhood. So again, that positive versus negative thing. From the comments, a lot of back and forth, but a lot of people saying there should be maximum size, and there also should be a minimum size allowed. You have this contingent of folks who are very much into the idea of having, quote, tiny homes available as, either main home construction or an ADU, and also a large contingent of people who are very much against them because they believe that they're going to lower property values or they're cheaply built or what have you. So there's kind of that internal conflict again. Now again, this one is not anything that's up for discussion that we've had in the past, but I just thought it was an interesting way of kind of gauging some of the opinion of the community and see where everybody's thinking about ADUs themselves. Finally, additional comments, I'll let you read through those. If you'd like, and I won't go through the ones that said, who thought of these stupid ideas and things like that. If anybody would like a full set of all the comments and everything, we can provide that to you. It'll probably be easier to email it because there are quite a few of them. So to kind of conclude with what the survey has told us, there is a majority of city folks who are not aware of our existing regulations, not surprising. The interest in building an ADU is kind of split 50-50. There's measured support for keeping or for construction on a neighboring parcel. You know, people might be okay with that under certain circumstances. There's broad support for keeping a parking space requirement, broad support for keeping the ownership requirement, and also supporting the covenant requirement. So we have kind of a philosophical conflict. People want to protect their neighborhoods. They're concerned about parking and storage of vehicles on the street. You see a lot of boats and RVs and things like that. And then on the other hand, you have the concern over too many government regulations. There's too many rules. The enforcement of the existing rules is somewhat inconsistent or perhaps overbearing or not enough, and desire for flexibility. So we have other considerations as well. What is the demand and interest in construction of ADUs? Since 2004, we've had 3 that were permitted. 2 of them were in 2004. So since that time, we've had 1. Impediments created by the code, what effect do these regulations have on construction? That's really hard to say. I've talked to a handful of people in the almost 4 years that I've worked here and told them about what the regulations were. Not had anybody come back and get a permit, but I don't know why. You know, I don't know if it's because they took down a pencil and a piece of paper and decided, wow, that's going to cost too much, or if they thought their regulations were too much, or if their circumstance changed. We can't really say for sure. And then the ADU is affordable housing. Again, we talked about this previously. It might be time to think of, instead of saying the ADU itself is an affordable housing unit, that the ADU is just another unit in a bigger selection to kind of stem that overall rising cost or average cost increase in the city of Oak Harbor. Because the thing is about ADUs, if you're constructing a new unit, it still costs a lot of money to build it. You can build cheaper ADUs by, carving out a portion of your house or converting your garage or something like that, but there still is a fairly significant cost involved. So in conclusion, the task force recommended changes. You have the 3 recommended changes: removing the parking requirement, not requiring the property owners to be on site, and not requiring the covenant. The research states or shows that above those items are fairly typical in other ordinances of comparable cities. We didn't get a sense of a strong consensus from the Planning Commission or the City Council regarding making changes immediately to the code. Survey of the community indicates fairly strong support for keeping those things in there. The survey also shows a wide range of opinions when dealing with ADUs and those regulations. And the existing code, while it has a few problems, is functioning at this time, and we're not seeing huge challenges or problems with it. So our recommendation in the staff report there is to make a few minor changes. Number 1 is to remove a sentence that talks about requiring 1 parking space or more as needed. And we feel that the or more as needed is way too nebulous. There's way too much room for interpretation there. 1 parking space is sufficient. Removal of a reference to a conditional use, which is no longer the process by which we do these. And then removal of section 1942-070, which refers to the registration of non-conforming units within a year of the original adoption of the code, which is now since long passed. So those are our recommendations based on the research and the survey that we've done, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
If I might, I think I should open the public
Certainly.
hearing now. The public hearing is now open in regards to the ADUs, so that anything that we discuss now is on the record as part of the public hearing. Okay, anybody have any comments? Questions for Ray?
If I might.
Yes.
Ray, did you look at this, or did anybody see this? I Googled ADU units, and the biggest study and the biggest comments were from Portland. Have you seen that?
I've seen a lot of information from various cities, so I don't know if it's specific to what you're talking about.
They talk about Portland, they talk about Seattle in that same, and it was quite an eye-opener, to read that. And they've got, it's two firms that did it, Martin J. Brown, and also the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And it's about a 49-page document, and I pulled up highlights about it. And what my opinion was on ADUs were changed when I read this document significantly, because I think they've got a total of like 800 in their city that they know of. Non-conforming, they don't necessarily always know about. But it was interesting, and surprisingly, the occupants of most of them are not the working people. It's 55 plus. It's almost like, okay, instead of going to a nursing home or something, son or daughter and their family move into the front house, and mom and dad move to the back house. Also interesting to find out that the majority of the ADU units that were detached were like 800 to 1,000 square feet. It also answered some other questions, and we talked about this before. The cost of something, 78 to 100,000. 78,000 to 100,000 doesn't include the utilities. It doesn't necessarily include the cost that the city will bear, or for the design plans and all of that. But it was still a positive report on that, and the rent in Portland, it ranges anywhere from $895 to $1,300 a month. That's not affordable. They also said it adds about $1,100 to the property tax bill on the primary unit structure. They don't talk about addresses. And where the biggest savings came in, from what I found, was when the ADU was actually incorporated into the existing structure. Now that brought up a question to me, was does the city allow garage conversions to habitable space?
Assuming it meets the building code, yes, we do. And the other key thing being there is you're required to have parking. The parking doesn't have to be in a garage. So you can provide that parking in an existing driveway or a new garage. But yes, the answer.
Well, that was the questions I had, but if you get a chance to Google it, it's a pretty interesting article. So if you want, I can give you this.
Sure, yeah.
Mostly just to summarize pieces of it, but it was very interesting, and it opened my eyes in a lot of different directions. So.
This is a really interesting subject to me, but I'm a little torn because it was first brought to us as a partial solution to the affordable housing problem. And, the three proposed changes, I don't think the conclusion would be that they necessarily provide a significant solution towards that, or really even make a dent in it. One of the things, particularly with older cities like Portland and Seattle, and of course even where they have a lot of alleyways and back entry parking and a lot of separate structures that can easily be converted into ADUs, it maybe makes sense. So we don't have a huge amount of that here in Oak Harbor, and I can see how there would be a lot of concern that adding a separate structure that doesn't already exist onto a property could affect the quality of life in the neighborhood. So there's a lot of concerns there. I don't necessarily take the survey as a scientific poll. I don't think that's what it was intended to. It was just to get a sense of how the people who are aware of the situation address it. But I do think before we make any major changes to the current policy that, we need more science. We talked about Bellingham just came up with a new ADU policy, which was fairly controversial, and Seattle's been talking about this for quite some time and maybe has some science based on their changes as to what is the impact on the neighborhoods. Does it affect property values? Does it help the affordable housing situation? So I'd like to approach things from a scientific approach rather than just an anecdotal approach, which I think is a little bit of what we have been asked to do with doing anything significant. So yeah, I support your proposal to keep the changes fairly minor for now.
And I think, if I may, that brings up an interesting point. Doing the research with this, I did find some non-anecdotal data, if you will, regarding the idea that having ADUs lowers property values or something. And what I read was that everything says that that's not the case. Well, then you look at the source, and the source was, I forget the name of the website, but it was some website that was a strong proponent of having ADUs. So you have to kind of take that information with a grain of salt. I think that there is a lot of fear of ADUs. When I worked at a previous jurisdiction, I processed ADUs as conditional uses. They went before the Planning Commission. And you would always get a kind of a throng of neighborhood folks who were very concerned about how this was going to lower their property values and increase traffic and all these things. Somebody would get an ADU approved, and then for years afterwards, we would hear nothing because they would blend right into the neighborhood because that's how the code was designed, was to make that happen. And so I think we have a similar code here that helps them blend in if they are built.
Yeah, and I think, for example, in Bellingham, where it was a fairly controversial issue, they've got they have a huge student population, and it's a concern in any place where there's a college and you're possibly going to have students living in them. That doesn't mean that they're not necessary or useful. But I think that the recent fad towards tiny houses also has left people with a little bit of misunderstanding. If we termed them mother-in-law quarters or guest houses, which is what they used to be traditionally called, I think that there's an entirely different perception of what is the impact on the neighborhood. If it's a mother-in-law quarter, it's keeping a family together.
Sure.
And that's a positive aspect, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I would like to see more data, if you will, as to what the long-term impact has been on cities maybe similar to ours,
Yeah.
but even a big city like Seattle or Portland. That's all I got.
I'd like to piggyback on you, Hal, on that, and with more data. We only had 96 respondents. So how is that really an efficient indicator of what our public in the city really feels?
Well, without being too glib, I would suggest that that's 96 more people than we have at these meetings. It's unfortunate, it's hard to get input on things like that because unless it's happening right next door to you, it's not that big a deal. But when it's happening right next door, all of a sudden it's a huge deal. So I think I was happy to get 96, let's put it that way. And while some of the comments were clearly just, we're not even going to go there, a lot of them were very thoughtful and people are thinking about these things. And, I think, like Hal said, this is not scientific. This is more just to kind of gauge the opinion or gauge the attitude of the community. And I think it accomplished that.
The one thing I would like to sit there and say, Ray, is first of all, I'm glad that you sat there and sent the survey out. It does match some of the same things that people I talk to, because people were concerned about the parking and about the lowering the cost of your houses and stuff like that. And I know just driving through the city and stuff like that, I've seen several times where I'm glad I'm not pulling a trailer, and I'm glad I'm not driving a big truck or anything like that there, because there is trucks and trailers, large ones, that are parked on the streets in the housing areas, and that does reduce. And if you sit there and get 2, 3, or 4 cars more like that, and the chance of it happening is slim, I admit it. But under the same aspect, it is a chance, and it needs to sit there and be looked at. And getting the opinions of the citizens of Oak Harbor, I think, is one thing that we need to do. And by you doing this here, I know we don't always get the response we want or the numbers that we want and stuff like that. But we have to sit there and keep trying to get the public to sit there and give the information on what kind of community they want. Because, face it, this is our community. This is not Seattle. This is not Bellingham. This is a community that we want here in Oak Harbor. And by getting the citizens' response to that, we can sit there and develop this here to keep it going the way we want it to go. Thank you.
Ray, I know you said you got 96 responses, and this went out in the utility mailing. How many households got that mailing?
Oh, you had to ask me that. I'm not certain on that. I want to say it was 12,000. No? Oh, I'm sorry. Is that my number's way off? Don't trust me. 2,500. Okay. Well, that's better then, because 96 out of 2,500 is a much better percentage. Yeah, it goes out in the utility bill. The follow-up, what we did is I was watching on the website to see when those responses started to die off, and then we had a Facebook post. And then they picked up again a little bit, and then they died off. And I had it open for about 2 weeks. I think it was 15 days total. And when I had 2 days in a row of no responses, I closed it down. There's only so much you can do at that point. Yeah.
My sense of this is that, based on what we've talked about, the information you got back, this is the changes that the Affordable Housing Task Force are asking for are not a solution to the problem they're trying to solve, and not something that there's a great deal of interest in the community. I mean, 96, yeah, that's not very many, but there's however many thousand people who weren't interested in an affordable house or in accessory dwelling units enough to even bother taking the survey. So I'm completely on board with the set of changes that you've made, and we can certainly revisit this if it becomes something that there's more demand about. But for now, I think what you're doing is just about right.
Yeah, and I think that the important point here is if there is suddenly a spike in demand, this is something we can certainly revisit.
Yeah.
And we have a basis for which we can have a discussion now that we've done this work.
Yeah. You know, one other thing that occurs to me is if we are requiring a parking space, I know there's a whole lot of work that the city has done on low impact development. Do we have guidance to people if they wanted to build an ADU, you know, and had to put in additional parking to use, you know, pavers that have holes in them to put up that parking or anything like that?
Not specifically, but I think if somebody got to the point where they were serious about construction, that's a discussion that we might have with them. Because there is, you know, the maximum square footage that you can add on before you start kicking off all these different LID methods of construction. So, you know, if they reach a certain point, they're going to have to move into that. And so that's something we probably have a discussion point when they are coming in and submitting to us. We say, oh, hold on, you need to do this and this. The addition, it's up to 2,000, or it's over 2,000 square feet of development. So generally for an ADU and a parking space, you probably wouldn't trigger that.
Yeah.
But, and honestly, I think that if you're seriously considering an ADU, your number one probably, I should clarify that. If you're seriously considering a detached ADU, you're probably on a larger lot. Mm-hmm. You might already have that side driveway, the third car driveway or whatever, that you're just going to plug that right in. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Would a tiny house that they advertise on TV, would that qualify?
It depends. Okay, so I'm glad you brought this up. So you have the tiny house that you might see on HGTV or something like that that's on a trailer, it's on wheels. Most of those are not going to meet the building code. This code requires that your ADU meets the building code. So quick answer to your question, no. However, you might be able to work that out. If you can build your trailer-based tiny home to meet the building code, by all means, pull it in and install it in there. But that means you have to install it on a foundation and do some of those things that folks with tiny homes that you might see on TV are probably not going to do. And so we would categorize one of those types of units as closer to an RV than we would a structure.
What about a modular home?
Modular versus manufactured, et cetera.
Correct.
I'll let Steve jump in.
By state law, which do that I did. Under state law, pardon me, we're required to allow manufactured homes to be sited in any single-family neighborhood where we would allow a stick-built home. And that's a special provision in the state law that we were required to put in our code, I think maybe about 2006-ish timeframe. And it was actually aimed at getting to more affordable housing. I won't call it affordable housing, but more affordable housing as an option. So we can impose any design considerations that we would impose on a stick-built house, but absent those, they need to meet the setbacks and all the other things, and yes, they could place a manufactured home on a single-family lot in town.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any other comments, questions? If not, I will close this portion of the hearing, public hearing, and then I would entertain a motion if we're prepared for that.
I move to recommend adoption of ordinance number 1828 to the City Council, making changes to Chapter 19.42 accessory dwelling units to Title 19 zoning of the Oak Harbor Municipal Code.
Okay, I have a motion, a second. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Motion passes. Thank you, Ray. The second item this evening is brought to us by Senior Planner Dennis Lefevre, Transportation Concurrency. And this too will be a public hearing.
Yes, thank you, Mr.
Dennis.
Chair.
Yep.
Members of the Planning Commission, this is your second presentation of the Transportation Concurrency Code Amendment that we're proposing. As I did at the last presentation, I'd like to go through a little bit of the background, what basically is our existing concurrency system, what we're proposing as part of this amendment tonight, and then also discuss with you some of the next steps. As I mentioned at the presentation last month, the Growth Management Act recognizes concurrency as one of their goals. Instead of reading this full definition, it's basically that new development needs to pay for its impacts on the public facilities and services. And certainly one of those public facilities is our street system. So this deals with that aspect of the concurrency requirement. We have been consistent and compliant with the Growth Management Act through our existing system since the enactment of this Growth Management Act in the early 1990s. As a background, you all recall that we did the transportation plan and had it adopted in middle of 2016. We identified half a dozen various goals in that plan, and one of them, which is highlighted for you, is a multimodal aspect. We also worked with Fair and Peers on this plan, and one of the key aspects is, not just focusing on the vehicle system and transportation that we have, but also what are the other modes of transportation that we need to address in this plan. Non-motorized bicycles, pedestrians, freight, transit, those types of things. That kind of carried through the whole philosophy of the plan and included a discussion of our levels of service. If you recall in the plan, we have our traditional automobile levels of service where we identify C and D as acceptable. In fact, D and E are acceptable as far as levels of service for vehicular travel. We also identified in the plan the multimodal aspects, including the transit, bicycle, and pedestrian. Those are a little less defined than the automobile levels of service, where it's more of a precise assessment of the impact for vehicular traffic. So the quality of service is kind of what we used in the plan to identify where some of those parameters are, how certain developments or certain aspects of those systems are being met or not. Our current system basically identifies, like I said, the number of trips added by new development. That is produced through the Institute of Transportation Engineers Manual. It's a given number for the type of use that's being proposed and added to the system. An assessment is made then based on that new development on nearby intersections. How is that traffic generated by this new development going to impact the levels of service of nearby intersections? In most cases, if the development is to the scale of required, they might have to do a traffic survey, which is an expense for that developer. As I mentioned earlier, our levels of service, which are adopted by us, indicate a levels of service D for nearby intersections and a levels of service E for intersections along State Route 20. So what we're looking at as far as the new system is concerned is kind of a transition away from that just vehicular aspect of concurrency to looking at that multimodal aspect. We're looking at more of a, instead of an intersection evaluation, how is that development going to impact the city as a whole, system completeness, so to speak. This will compare the transportation projects built by the city. It would increase, those projects will increase the capacity that can be handled by the transportation system in the city. And then those new developments will be assessed on that citywide assessment. Instead of the development and nearby intersections, it'll be viewed at a citywide perspective instead. Capacity will be measured in dollars. Projects will be assessed as far as the cost for development. Those dollars will be then transferred into the capacity mechanism, which we will use as a tool here to assess where we are currently with the number of trips available and our system-wide capacity based upon the impact that that new development will occur or will have on that system. For instance, the example given here, I think is an apartment. We have based on our comprehensive plan, a running start of approximately 667 trip capacity within our system, system-wide again. The new projects that we are proposing through our 6-year transportation improvement program, like for instance, Northeast 7th Avenue, has been assessed based on the cost of that project into additional trips on our system-wide capacity. That assessment is approximately 1,944 for that project alone. So that added on to our existing trips available in our capacity is approximately 2,300, something like that. But then the trips assessed on that apartment through the ITE manual will be deducted from that total capacity of the whole system, which means we'll basically have plenty of capacity left even with that new development coming on board. The other aspect that we are ensuring through this program is that that development provides safe access to it. We still need to make sure that people can get into the development, get out of the development safely. So that will be an aspect that we'll be utilizing and incorporating into the system. Essentially, the tool that we'll be using is what you see right here. It's a spreadsheet. It should be a lot more user-friendly as far as the administration in the city. Right now, it's in the engineering department, and they've had some issues with utilizing the current system. So this is going to be a tool that's going to be a lot easier for them to utilize. The next steps to this process, actually the first two are the last two steps, but Planning Commission's meeting was in April 24th where the initial presentation was made on this amendment. City Council had a workshop the next day where we had a presentation by Fair and Peers, Kendra Breland. And then tonight's the Planning Commission public hearing. Based on your recommendation, we'll take that forward to City Council for their adoption in July or August of this year. So with that, that concludes staff's presentation. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions after the public hearing.
Yeah, at this time, I will open the public hearing in regards to transportation concurrency. Commissioners have any questions for Dennis or comments?
When would this go into effect?
Approximately 5 days after the adoption by the city council.
Good plan.
Any other comments, questions?
You mentioned, and it talks in here about this, the capacity of the system being maintained in a spreadsheet. And I'm curious about what the visibility of that spreadsheet would be to the public. You know, there's a list of overall capacity and encumbrances and reservations. Is that something that would be available on the website, or if people were curious about it, they'd have to contact the planning department for that information? How is that visible to people?
I believe, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would still be administered in Public Works, the engineering staff, and it would be accessible to the public upon request.
Okay.
Any other comments from the folks in the audience? Any concerns, questions? If not, I'll close this public hearing. And now I would entertain a motion, if I might.
I move to recommend adoption of ordinance number 1836 to the city council, repealing and replacing chapter 11.32, transportation concurrency, to title 11 of the Oak Harbor Municipal Code.
I have a motion. Do I have a
Second.
second? And a second. Call for the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion passes. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, commissioners.
Good job.
And the next item is also Dennis, small cell deployment, public meeting. Dennis?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is your first touch on this item. It is small cell deployment, and essentially what I'd like to discuss as part of this initial touch with this item is go into a little bit of the background, identify some of the demand by the wireless carriers, what we have taken as an approach to deal with some of the issues that we may have seen come out of this, discuss the proposed ordinances which are in your packet, and then also identify some of the next steps that we anticipate taking. As we're all familiar and know quite well, cell phone usage, mobile data usage is all increasing by everybody. Continues to create that demand. And in fact, with some of these wireless carriers, the demand is becoming such that they need to look at some other methods to meet that demand. Verizon has indicated that within from 2014 to 2019, their demand is going to increase 57%. Cisco indicates at the same time period that their demand has increased 650%. AT&T, from 2007 to 2015, their usage has increased 150,000%. So that identifies that there's a need out there. These wireless carriers are trying to meet that need. And certainly the traditional methodology by creating these macro towers is becoming very difficult to do, especially in communities that basically don't want to see these towers go up in their backyard. Becoming very cumbersome for these wireless carriers to meet this wireless mobile demand. So what is being done? The new technology that's being proposed is called a small cell. And essentially what that does is it provides a smaller unit that will provide access to more of a pedestrian scale rather than the towers to these folks. For instance, this graphic shows that the red folks don't have service. With a smaller cell, these folks will have service. Another example of where you have a microsite on top of a structure, it really doesn't reach the folks down in the sidewalk area. So these smaller cells would be located so that they would provide access and usage availability to the public. The scale of these typically are a lot smaller than your macro towers, which can range from 80 to 120 feet sometimes. The smaller cells obviously are just that. They're a lot smaller, 30 feet tops, and can be utilized in far more variety of places, such as a power pole, a light pole, or existing structures. They can be utilized in all of those types of facilities. And of course, light poles and power poles are typically within the public right-of-way. Some of the equipment that is typical for a small cell, you have an antenna, you have the power conduit heading down to a termination box, and then you have a power disconnect. That's about the deepest my knowledge base will go on this technology, but basically that's what entails a small cell. It gives you the capability to provide more capacity. What do these guys look like? Well, for instance, the pole on the left is a typical pole without a small cell. The pole on the right has the small cell capability. So it can be designed so that it blends in pretty nicely with your character or whatever light pole design you might have as a standard. So why are we at this point in the first place? Well, in 2017, the communications industry introduced a bill to the state legislature, which seemed to have the power to basically preempt any local authority as far as how we can institute some standards, design standards, locational requirements, that type of thing. So what we did as a city was join a consortium with other cities in Western Washington, I think Western Washington primarily, which sought the services of Ogden, Murphy, and Wallace, who is renowned for their knowledge on small cell capabilities. This firm prepared some draft ordinances which allowed us to look at our community and provide some nuances in these ordinances that gave us our character, our flavor in these ordinances. That was through the course of pretty much the last half of last year. Well, this year, again, in the state legislature, this session, there were several pieces of legislation, again, regarding small cells. So, not wanting to be dictated by the state legislature, we moved forward and adopted a couple of ordinances prior to any bill approval. What we did was, on an interim basis, on March 6th, the City Council adopted two primary ordinances, and under the interim tag, according to state requirements, we had to have a public hearing within 60 days, and as Steve mentioned earlier, we did that in April. And the effective date for an interim ordinance is no longer than 6 months. So what we are doing is kind of going through that process from the beginning, engaging the Planning Commission for your review. We will probably make some subsequent minor refinements on these ordinances, but essentially what these ordinances do in number 1830 is it creates Chapter 1107, which deals with the process that we would like to see on a local basis for permitting these small cells. We're linking that up to the franchise and right-of-way use agreements, which we already have in place. We are calling out that any small cell permit is an administrative review, which is consistent with another section that we have in our municipal code. And the requirement for a carrier to place these small cells, they must have a franchise agreement either in place or they must apply for one at the same time. And if they also apply for small cell deployment, that would be considered a master permit. So we have a mechanism in place for that. And then also, we establish permit timelines, which is consistent with federal guidelines, which we've had established in our code already. The second ordinance for your consideration and review is number 1831. And what this does is deal with the development standards. how they will look, how will we place them consistent with our existing poles in our right-of-way, some of the dimensional requirements, how are we going to deal with the ground equipment, if there is any, so make sure that there's passage and ADA accessibility. And another piece of this is that we were able to integrate some of our own character, such as we would require a concealment plan for small cells that are placed in the central business district, the maritime district, and of course along our scenic byway, which is State Route 20, which gives us some of the local character. We're able to control some of that amenity that we want them to look nice or blend into our community in those specific zones. So that was one of the advantages of moving forward with this set of ordinances prior to any state legislature coming up with their schemes for us. So tonight, this is just a meeting. It is not a hearing, but we are looking at you folks taking this month and reviewing this, coming back with any potential comments that you might have on this set of legislation. I think we're going to have somewhat of a refinement also to present to you, because I've heard some information coming from that law firm that is dealing with another aspect of small cells, and it's called, I think I have a picture actually, strand-mounted facilities. And they sent us some additional information that will probably encompass into a revised ordinance for your review at the next meeting. We would look at the public hearing in June, and then take this through final city council adoption in August, which still is within that 6-month required time frame. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Dennis, I'm a little confused about, was there not a public hearing regarding this issue? Or what was the public hearing? I mean, my understanding is you only have one public hearing.
Well, according to state law, if a council adopts an interim ordinance, they're required to have a public hearing within 60 days. That's what the hearing was in April.
Okay.
We have 6 months now for presentation of the Planning Commission, get your input, and then take this through the process again, and then present your recommendation to City Council, like I said, sometime in August.
These two ordinances were adopted or they were signed in March, correct?
That would be correct, yes,
Okay,
March
so
6th.
That was before the public hearing, for the interim?
Yep. And the interim is the tag that is kind of the trigger. And, you know, they can do that, but they have to go through this process then to make it a permanent ordinance.
And if I could expand on that, Mr. Chairman, the one hearing rule that you're talking about applies to project permits. So when we're talking about like a subdivision, we're allowed to have only one hearing on that. And then to expand just a little bit further, you can think of the interim ordinances in the sort of the same bucket as where the moratoriums come from. And so when the city places a moratorium on something, be it a particular development within a particular zoning district or something along those lines, you can do that without a public hearing so that you can get that measure in as a stopgap quickly. But again, that same state law that Dennis is referencing says, okay, you can have that initial approval without benefit of a hearing, you can do it quickly, but within 60 days, you have to have a hearing so that the public can comment on really what the council had previously done. And so so when you look at this, you see a signature in March. That was because that was that quick implementation because we were trying to beat the state. Then we followed on with the public hearing that was necessary for the council's action. And now, Planning Commission, when you're ready, will conduct your own public hearing just like it was a quote-unquote normal process.
Thank you for the clarification. Appreciate that. Have questions at this point?
The one comment I would like to sit there and make on that is I'm glad to sit there and see that because I remember a couple years ago when they were putting a cell tower, and I don't remember who it was, it doesn't really matter. But a cell tower was going in the Oak Harbor, and I remember pretty specific at that time being told, you know, by the administrator or by the staff and stuff that we really didn't have much of a say-so with where that could go. The cell phone companies were the ones that determined that because, unfortunately, I mean, obviously, they know where the dead zones were. So, I mean, some of that made sense. But under the same aspect, I'm glad to see that this time here we do have some input on what we want, how it's going to be designed, and where it's going to be located. So that does gives a little bit more options for us because in the same aspect, I remember in 2002, or actually 2001, making a phone call. I was interviewing me for a job, and it was back in Wisconsin. I was dealing with it, or talking with the company, and I was over in St. Augustine parking lot. I mean, you think that would be a pretty good place for cell reception. 2001, no, it wasn't. I dropped phone calls several times, and that was for a job interview. You know, I didn't get the job, that's why I'm still here. But in the same aspect, I'm glad. I mean, it worked out for the best.
Wisconsin winters are hard, though.
It wouldn't have been good for my family. I'm glad it worked out. But under the same aspect, I'm glad to see that this time here, there's a lot more input that we have to get what we would like and to develop this here into more what we want for our community, the looks and stuff like that, because that's very important. That's why we live in Oak Harbor, not Seattle, not Portland, not all these other places. We want our own community, and it's good to sit there and see that we're starting to get in some of it. Thanks.
I was pretty pleased with the amount of detail, you know, for all the different, whether it be building sites, streetlights, utility poles, the concealment, the color coordination and all of that. I thought it was very well written. And it's not just going to be in your face type issue. We all watch movies and TV and things where you see how obvious the cell sites and towers are. And I think this kind of softens it for everybody.
I think that was a wise move by the city to become part of that consortium to get that expert assistance on this, yes.
Because all too often, the state legislature could just, stamp and say, this is what you do. You don't have to do anything more. And I think this is a good way to put our foot in the door and say, hey, along with other cities, these are the kind of things we want, because we don't want 50 different versions of a cell tower placement and all that throughout the state of Washington. So the consortium is a very good option for us, I believe.
Right. Couple of questions. Did the state end up doing any kind of policy or?
It actually came down to the last day of the session, and they did not pass legislation.
Okay.
But it was threatening at that point.
Another question. So we're in the process of rebuilding Windjammer Park, and we've got another beautiful park up at Fort Nugent and possibly a ball fields up north side of town. If we have established, streetlights or those kind of things in some of these parks, and one of the cell phone companies wants to put one of these small cells on one of our streetlights in a park, which is quite possible, right? I mean, can we make them completely replace the streetlight in order to make it match their architecture, or are they going to be able to plug something onto the outside of this that kind of quasi matches but doesn't necessarily exactly other than color?
That's a good question.
And I know
That is a good question.
The parks, there is no park zone for requiring certain
That's
architectural.
correct.
So maybe, can we add that?
Well, parks are different, and we may not actually allow them to be in parks. The push from the industry was for the right-of-way, because they perceived, from the industry's perspective, they were drawing these conclusions. We are a utility, therefore we have a right to be in the public rights-of-way, therefore we have the ability to dictate what our facilities look like. And what the cities were saying through this consortium was time out. It's not automatic that you are a utility, and it's not automatic that you get to be in the public right-of-way without having a franchise. And that's why in Dennis's presentation, you saw the connection between the franchise and the small cell deployment, and then that master permit concept. And so what we're doing here is regulating where they were trying to go essentially at no or low cost, which would have been in the right of way.
So in a park, they're essentially another vendor or contractor who wants to.
And that would be through, if that would be allowed, then that would be through a lease agreement of of a different kind of public property than public right of way. And in that case, you absolutely have the ability as the landlord, if you will, to say what that facility has to look like. But to follow on, and not actually the question that you asked, but that's why we're having these design standards. And that's why we're saying, okay, even within the right of way, like within the downtown, we have a special light pole style in the downtown. You're not going to be able to replace that, Mr. Carrier, with your basic Cobra head light pole. You're going to have to choose one that is, very similar to this one, and then put your facility inside of that pole, or otherwise camouflage it in a way which we find to be acceptable.
Yeah, that, I lived in Las Vegas for a long time, and they got these fake palm trees all over the place that are supposedly cell towers, and they actually have one that's 100-foot tall spruce sitting out in the middle of the desert, and of course, that doesn't grow there. So I'm just, I have these fears that we're going to end up with a palm tree on Pioneer Way, and, yeah. So that's not going to happen.
So when I worked for the city of Phoenix, I can tell you that I have placed them in fake rocks on the side of mountainsides. But thankfully there were rocks also there naturally occurring on the side of the mountainside. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I have one more question. With this, say we move forward during the public hearing and we enact this ordinance, and then the state legislature comes and moves this thing forward, and they say, you can do whatever you want to do. That's going to supersede our ordinance, won't it?
Well, we have the interim ordinances already in place. So what we're doing is we're just going through the process to make these permanent. But in the eyes of the state, I think these are good as law.
So it would be a big deal for the state to adopt legislation that usurps that local authority once that local authority has already been established. And that was why Oak Harbor and many communities were so focused on getting something in place before the close of the 2018 session. That's why Association of Washington Cities, or AWC, was recommending that all its member cities really pay attention to this particular topic, because it's much harder for the state to overrule us, if you will, once we already have them in place. But if they beat us to the punch, then they have a better opportunity to say that this is an area where they're going to preempt local control.
My understanding was, I watched the portions of the city council's meetings on this, both from March 6th and April 17th, before coming in tonight, and my understanding was the city attorney was pushing forward on this because our ordinance would be grandfathered in to any state law that would put things out, which I thought was very foresightful on the city's part. As you said, your slide had that the macro towers have a capacity for 72 cell phones over a 1 square mile area. Do you have any information about the capacity for these small cells?
I don't know the capacity, but I've seen the range of 10 meters to hundreds of meters. Distance-wise as far as their service, but I don't know capacity-wise.
Fair enough. Do you have any kind of sense of how many of these small cell deployments we might expect in the city limits?
I do not. I don't know what the need is. I don't know where the gaps are, if there are any. Steve, have you come across?
I don't think there's certainly, I'm not aware of a number, but actually, your question is kind of one of the main reasons that the consortium was pulled together, because when the gap exists there for AT&T, that same gap generally exists for Sprint and it exists for Verizon because they share facilities, right? But not always. And so, or they at least co-locate on the same vertical facility. And so when you're trying to plug a hole, you might see 4 of these small cell deployments, all within very close vicinity to each other. And so while one of them you might look at and say, well, that's not a big deal, it's just a box about yay big,
Yeah.
right? But now if you've got one of those on every corner at the intersection, and one of the things that wasn't in Dennis's slide is that sometimes there's above ground equipment vaults as well that go with that. And so you may see something that comes down that pole and back to an above ground vault. And so now if you start proliferating that on your corners, that's where the visual impact is really coming from.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to go back to that slide, but you have a slide earlier in this with a wooden pole, and it's horrible looking. That one, yes, that's awful. Whereas the next one, which is on the dock, that actually, if we had a corner that had one of those on all 4 corners, your proposed, that would be okay.
But the other one would not be
but
so
the other
much
one-
okay. Yeah.
Oh, no, it's horrible. Yeah. I guess the last thing I was curious about is with the franchises, how many carriers do we have? These are franchises the carriers get from the city, is that right?
The carriers would be required to get a franchise agreement through the city, yes.
Do we have a limit on how many carriers get franchises, or is it pretty much anybody who wants to? Or how does that work?
Well, I don't believe that we have any of the cell phone carriers that currently have franchises with the city. The ones that we have franchises with the traditional utility providers, Puget Sound Energy, Verizon, or their Frontier, those individuals, and those are what you think of maybe as the more traditional franchise above ground wired and poles sort of facilities. But I don't think we have any right now, and I don't believe there would be a theoretical limit. There might be a practical limit in terms of the use of the space.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It'd be an interesting problem to work your way through.
Yeah. Okay. That's all I've got. Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And the next item on the agenda this evening is, CAC is going to walk us through this, the Garry Oak Tree Protection Ordinance. And this too is a public meeting. CAC?
Good evening, CAC Senior Planner. So here to introduce some amendments to our oak tree protection ordinance. Oak trees, as you all know, namesake to the city of Oak Harbor, has a pretty good significance in our vision statement. It's in our actual vision statement to have these assets to our community be sustainable. And the city has gone through and adopted regulations to how these trees are trimmed and protected on private property as well. So just as a comparison, zoning regulations are regulation of private property development. And so zoning under case law has had a long standing there, and therefore you use that as a tool to determine what uses, where they are located, so on and so forth. And so it's a regulation of private property. Oak trees and trees are not normally regulated by cities unless it's part of a landscape ordinance or a buffer or so on and so forth. So Oak Harbor is unique, and unique in the sense, I mean, there are other jurisdictions that also have assets such as this, but not all cities have ordinances to protect trees on private property. So this is somewhat unique to Oak Harbor, and Oak Harbor has chosen to do this. And so in the 90s, they hired a private consultant to come up with an ordinance, and they came up with the ordinance for protecting the oak trees and so on at that time. Since then, that ordinance has been kind of shuffled around in our zoning code, because what they had as a code was repetitive of some of the things that we already do. And so through the implementation of that, back, I want to say in the early 2000s, they made the oak tree a critical area, similar to wetlands and so on for our purposes, moved some section of the code into that section. And then there are other sections of the code that deals with oak trees, and they've been put in the zoning ordinance where you do have control over the, where you have regulations for private property. So they've been kind of scattered around a little bit. And so we went through some of this when we dealt with some variance language regarding the Rose Hill development. So just to give you a short history on how that happened. So originally when they adopted the code for the oak tree protection, it basically said if you had a tree in the middle of your property and if it's a vacant lot, the original language allowed for you to cut the tree down and put a house. When it went in the 2000s to a more, when the language got pushed around and there was probably a good strong support for the oak tree, and the variance language came in terms of giving flexibility to move the structure around on the lot without having to take the tree down. So there was a little push to have it be a little more regulated. But what they did at that time was they said, well, you can push the house on the lot, but you can't get closer than, and they had a distance there. And that's what we came back a year or two ago when the Rose Hill development was happening, because they had a tree that kind of didn't allow for that. They needed to push the house closer, and you had to kind of assess the community values. And of course, the oak tree was a significant asset to the city, so we had adopted the amended language to allow structures to get pushed even closer to the setback in order to save a tree. So that was kind of, that discussion was going. As we were going through that discussion, there was public input from the Garry Oak Society about some additional protective measures for the oak tree. And so at that time, we were just looking at the variance language, but general protective measures did come as a topic in that discussion. And so staff said, well, right now we'll deal with the variance language, and then we'll come back and deal with more protective measures. And so this is kind of the follow-up action to that discussion. So this section of the code is in our critical area section, and I'll go through a brief presentation. Like I said, the discussion, the amendments originated when we were dealing with the variance code for the Rose Hill subdivision. And most of the discussion was on there's suitable protective measures. That's what it kind of says. It leaves things very general. Suitable, somebody doing construction of a development should take suitable protective measures. And the council and the public input at that time indicated that suitable was very general and we need to have more specific language. So that's kind of how we're at this point here. So the current code talks about suitable protective measures, and the suitable protective measures is so general because oak trees are not conveniently located on properties. They are all over the place, and so every site is different when dealing with them. And part of that generalness, if we as staff can address an issue with the property owner, we address that. But in cases where it's challenging, we ask that an arborist be hired to give suggestions, because we don't have an arborist on staff to provide that expertise. And we require them to do a site-specific construction plan, which is what we kind of did with Rose Hill, by the way. I mean, in approving the variance and that development, we did require some of them to hire an arborist and give us the construction plans and so on and so forth. So the suitable protective measures works well for new development. Rose Hill is a new development. They're coming in, putting a new house on a new lot. And so they can push the house and make adjustments. Where it gets really challenging is alterations, redevelopments, expansions of existing homes and stuff. That's where things get a little challenging in terms of how those suitable protective measures work. So how does it work currently? I mean, today if there's an accessory structure that's being built, probably in the older part of town, and a building permit has been issued, which is somewhat close to the oak tree, they would, and if they come across a root system or something like that, they're supposed to stop work and call the city. The city would go out there and find creative ways to try and mitigate for what they discovered. So even though this kind of works well from a property owner perspective, because they don't have to do a lot of upfront work, you know, they may miss root system, they may build a structure without impacting the oak tree. And so they don't have to do that upfront work and they can go ahead. But it doesn't give the community or staff the assurance that things have been adequately protected. So that's the kind of status of the current code. So what do the proposed amendments do? The proposed amendments bring in some very specific protective measures. And actually we did some research, staff did research, looked at other cities and ordinances that have just general tree protection sections. We looked at some research material from the industry, you know, arborists and forestry section. And the Garry Oak Society also provided some input regarding, you know, protecting trees from what they have learned and probably experienced. So what we have in front of you is a draft code with some of the protective measures. And how we've established it is, you know, if you have a tree on your property, you know, the root zone is the main thing, and thanks to the Garry Oak Society that provided that input, initially we were going with the canopy. You know, that's kind of what we were going with, you know, the tree canopy. But trees can be slanted, trees can have, you know, different proportions of foliage and still have the root system pretty expansive. So I think the main idea is to find out where that critical root zone is and protect that more than anything else. So we have some language in there, and again, this is from literature that we've researched. You know, the typical standard, I think, is to have a root zone that is somewhat proportional to the trunk of the tree. And so you measure it at about 4.5 feet, and I have language in the code that says, so for every inch, you have a foot of radius around the tree that you want to protect as a critical root zone. And the language goes on to say you want to have some barriers to make sure that people that are working on site don't damage the soil composition. The soil composition is important for the trees. Put signage up to indicate that, you know, this is an off-limits area. And then you still want to protect the roots that are coming out of that barrier area. You know, trees don't know barriers; they're going to have roots wherever. And so you still want to protect the larger root system when they do get out of the barrier. And so we have some language addressing that. And of course, storage of material and so on. And I think this is one thing that stemmed some public comment is the current tree on that Rose Hill development, and I think it has been done for years. Some dirt has been pushed around the root zone, and they've amended the soil composition, and so language to prevent that. And then, you know, washing trucks or equipment and things like that can contribute towards you know, some kind of contamination, so we have language regarding that as well. So what you have in front of you is some specific measures that a property owner would have to take. What are the pros and cons for that? Well, a property owner now coming in for a building permit will have to provide some of this information up front if they have an oak tree on the property. So they have to do some proactively develop some drawings or think through what they have to do in order to protect the oak tree. And this can get challenging because, like I said, oak trees are not conveniently located. They're sometimes located right next to a house, or sometimes they're on a fence. Sometimes they're on the other side of the fence with the root zone affecting the neighboring, you know, the property that you're working on. So these are all challenges that we have to deal with implementation. And as we implement, of course, we'll think about all the issues. We can't think of all the problems right now that will come up and try to solve them. That's why the current language of suitable measures was in place, because we can't, you know, everything is unique. So having specific measures helps, but it can also hinder or require a property owner to do a lot of upfront work if there's a Garry Oak on their property or maybe even adjacent to the property because of the critical root zone that may be affected. So these are all potential challenges that the city can hear about when you put in additional regulation. Anytime you're regulating private property and its development, we'll always hear it. I mean, I go out to deal with oak tree trimming permits, and trust me, people don't want to get a permit or permission from the city when they want to trim their own tree. So when you deal with development activities like this, we'll always hear some pushback when you say, okay, I need exhibits that show what you're going to do, how far it is, and how your development does not impact the tree. These are all additional measures that they will have to take, and sometimes you can't predict it. Sometimes they may not do the project at all, or sometimes they may complain about how the project costs have gone up because of some of these measures. So these are just the pros and cons, but it's a good thing to. So what we have in the language as well is the ability to evoke an arborist. For them to hire an arborist if needed. So if we come to a challenging situation where we don't have enough information or the existing protective measures are not going to adequately protect the tree, then we're going to still require an arborist, because in the original language, that's what we would have done. We would have asked them to do that anyway. So we've specifically noted that as one of the options to get an arborist as well. As we were going through the amendment, again, the Garry Oak Society provided some input on, they wanted to find a way to say that, the oak tree should be protected from ivy as well. We've lost a couple of trees in the public right-of-way because the ivy from the property has just choked out the tree, and you don't know what's going on, behind the ivy. So that's the language that we added in. Again, there's pros and cons to that. Anytime somebody wants to do something in their backyard, whether it's a garden or whatever, and an ivy starts creeping up, and you have the city knocking on their door saying that they can't do certain things. So again, it's a fine line on how we manage that. So these are the proposed amendments. This is, as I said, it's just introducing these measures and starting a public discussion on it. It's just a public meeting. We'll go through an amendment process similar to any other text amendments we do. We're right now kind of going through the SEPA review process for that, and we'll come back with a hearing to the Planning Commission and the City Council once we have that process done. So what we'd like to do is answer any questions that you have, and also open up the discussion with the public and take public comments on this as well.
Very
Questions?
good. Questions from the council?
Oh,
Is there any requirement for the building department to check the current inventory of Garry Oaks to see if, when a homeowner comes with a request for a permit, that they have to go through these procedures?
We do ask for a site plan when we do building permits, usually alterations. And actually in the last 6 months, we've had a couple lots that came forward that did have Garry Oaks, and they noted those Garry Oaks present. And we had actually put some conditions on the building permit similar to the protective measures that we're listing. So it'll get more and more incorporated as we get more alterations and redevelopment.
Because, I mean, in theory, quite honestly, there may be some people who don't know that they have a Garry Oak. I mean, it's possible.
It's possible, but I think we have quite the vigilant group here in Oak Harbor that anybody that does anything close to an oak tree, we're usually notified.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions from the?
Yeah. So I guess kind of following what Hal said, does the city maintain an inventory of these trees?
We have an inventory of the public trees
But
in the
not
public
trees?
right-of-way and the parks. There may have been a study done on some locations of private property, but I don't think we've done a real extensive inventory of them.
Okay. Do we have a sense of what percentage of the lots in Oak Harbor are affected by this? And just, ballpark figure, is it?
It's
Three
mostly
quarters of the
area-wise. I wouldn't say percentage of lot. The older parts of town are mostly where we have most of the oak trees.
Okay.
And most of them know that they have oak trees. When they buy property and then they want to do something, they quickly find out that they have to deal with the city in terms of oak trees, and some of them are happy about it, and some of them buy houses because they have the oak trees on them, they love them.
Sure.
And love to take care of them. They're great people to work with. And then we do have people that own property that are not aware that they are regulated, and so they are sometimes unhappy that they are regulated.
I can imagine that being the case. Two other things, and I'm not an attorney, don't play one on television, but is there an eminent domain consideration here that people have property they own? I'm completely in favor of protecting these trees, but if the city is going to say there are things you can't do with your property because there's this tree here, is there an issue where the city should or does compensate people for the loss of the use of their property?
Our oak tree ordinance has not been challenged in court.
Okay.
So till then, we can keep regulating it like we think we're doing the right thing, till we get challenged. And we've had difficult instances. We have even trimming. It's fences and trees are neighborly issues that even the courts struggle with, as minor as they are. Tree limbs extending over property lines and impacting neighbors' property, and the city's involvement in providing a trimming permit is challenging, because who do you provide the permit to? To the person that wants to trim it, the person that has it. So we try our best to be the middle person, and we say, you need to talk to your neighbor, you need to inform them, and we kind of try to get it that way, but not all property owners want to talk to their neighbors either. So,
So- I'm sorry. I just wanted to add on to the question about eminent domain, which there's a concept known as regulatory takings. And we're actually required by the state of Washington to make sure that our ordinances don't create a regulatory takings. And in short, that concept is that if we're creating regulations which are taking all of the economic value from a piece of property, we're not supposed to implement those regulations. One of the advantages of having the Garry Oaks identified as a critical areas is that it allows us to take advantage of the provisions in the critical areas code that are known as the reasonable use provisions.
Okay.
And those provisions are the ones which give a property owner an out, right? So if you had a vacant lot that had a Garry Oak tree smack dab in the middle of it,
Yeah.
and it was essentially using up through its drip line canopy area, 85% of the lot, we're not allowed to tell you that you don't have any economic use of your property, because that would be a regulatory takings, and then we're writing a check, right?
Right.
And so by using the reasonable use provisions within the critical areas general regulations, that property owner has the ability to go before the hearing examiner and say, look, here are all the problems that come up as a result of implementing this particular regulation, and the hearing examiner has the ability to grant them relief from those rules.
Okay.
And so we're pretty fussy about making sure that we don't create regulatory takings.
Good.
Yeah. In fact, there's Attorney General guidance on how not to do that.
Oh, okay,
and
good.
we try really hard to follow that.
And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why the Garry Oak got pushed into the critical area ordinance, because then you have a methodology to deal with situations that are difficult and not just be a regulatory taking. So,
And that's also why you see that even before its time becoming a critical area, the code said, well, if you have a Garry Oak on your property, you can reduce the amount of parking that you have to provide, otherwise would have to have provided. And there were some setback variances that were allowed automatically without going through a hearing process. And that was a way to move that building envelope and those accessory uses around on that property while still keeping the Garry Oak in place.
Right.
But even those in extreme circumstances may not solve the problem. And that's what the reasonable use provisions do.
Okay. All right. And then the last question I had was that we have provisions in here to require the use of an arborist. How much arborist capacity do we have locally? Are there arborists here who can look into that?
We
Do you have to
do.
bring somebody in from out of town? Or?
Sometimes we have people bring them out from out of town, but we have a couple companies here that do a lot of trimming work. Some of the trimming is done by local arborists, and they know our code. And so when somebody calls them and says, "I want you to trim that tree," they go, "It's a Garry oak. You need a permit." So yes, we do have a couple companies here that have arborists, and we have even other arborists, I think, that freelance in Oak Harbor.
Okay. I can imagine that becoming a significant expense in the course of development or redevelopment, and that would be another place where maybe we're imposing costs on homeowners that maybe the city should help them out with. So, but as long as we have reasonable access to that, it's probably fine. Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Cecil?
How many hearings have we had dealing with Garry Oaks with citizens, homeowners, and stuff like that? Has there been one, or?
I can only think of one, and it was a rather high-profile one over here on Fidalgo, on the vacant lot just to the west of Help House. There is a very substantial-sized Garry oak located right down along the Fidalgo frontage, and 2006-ish, maybe 2006, maybe 2007. There was a development application for a mixed-use project on that site, and they sought not a permit to cut the tree down, but to substantially prune the tree. And that was outside of what staff's ability to adjust was under our code. And so, but since it was a critical area, they pursued it through the hearing examiner. Ultimately, that application was approved, but we put a condition in there that said that the trimming couldn't be undertaken, or the pruning couldn't be undertaken until the building permit was issued. The project never went forward, therefore no building permit, therefore no extreme pruning of the tree. But that's the only one that I can recall that we've had go to the hearing examiner.
And then my last question is, who pays for the hearing examiner? Is the property owner?
Yes, there's an application fee for that, and it's certainly probably not in the range of cost recovery, but there is an application fee.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? And the public, anybody in the audience that would like to?
Hi,
No.
I'm Laura Reniger from the Oak Harbor Garry Oak Society. And I just want to say that our group does endorse this more prescriptive approach to the Oak Tree Protection Code, which is what CAC's been talking about and working towards. Trees, when you think about Oak Harbor, we don't have a lot of the old-time 100, 200-year-old buildings. But we do have old trees. And those old trees are part of our natural landscape, and they are our treasures. And they do represent the flavor of our community. So we do have a few comments here. The last draft that we saw was in February of 2018. We would suggest starting each sentence under paragraph 2, building or construction operations, items A through C, suggest starting with the words prior to construction, just to be clear. And why is this important? Well, we submitted a photo there for you from November of 2017 from the Weeby News-Times when they moved the old Ely house out of the Presbyterian Church property. And the trees around them had absolutely no protection at all. There was never any protection provided for the critical root zone when the foundation was removed at a later date. So that's why that word suitable protection is just really not adequate. Regarding the invasive English ivy, we submitted some photos there, a photo that shows a mature Garry oak that was killed by the ivy. Ivy is not just decorative, it actually is listed as an invasive species in Island County.
It's a noxious weed.
Last, I would like you to ponder a piece of a Whitby News Times editorial, which I submitted in full to you all from Microfiche. That was from August of 1990, when the original Garry Oak Tree Protection Code was conceived. I quote, "City Council ordered Attorney Phil Blale to draft a law to protect the remaining oaks in the city. The ordinance should be strongly worded so it really protects trees. Oak Harbor developers in the future should not be able to view a lot with standing oaks on it as a blank canvas where they can create whatever they please. Instead, they will need to consider the trees as part of the city's heritage and design around them." It looks like my time is ticking out. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Oh, and one more
Appreciate
thing. We have done an inventory. Our group has an informal inventory. We don't have the GPS capacity yet, but we're working towards that. That will hopefully capture the public and private trees. Just our real informal one we did a couple years ago. We came up with about 700 trees total, but only 3% of those trees are juvenile trees. So we're talking about protecting the granddaddy trees that we have now. Thanks.
it. Great, thank you. Any other public comment this evening? Anything from the commissioners?
No, thank you.
Okay, with that, we will go on with the last item on the agenda this evening. CAC, Kamak, Senior Planner, the 2018 Comprehensive Plan Amendment, Park Plan Update.
You'll be happy to hear that I don't have much information on the parks plan. We're working on the draft document. We are actually going to the city council tomorrow at their workshop and talking about the 6-year implementation plan that we talked with the planning commission at the last meeting. And then we'll, hopefully that will allow us to come up with a list of projects that will help us with some impact fee discussion. We have park impact fees as part of our existing plan and development, and so there's some more work on the financial side that will be done, and that'll come back to the planning commission as well. So currently we're just working on the document and moving that forward. I don't have any special updates for you.
Okay, thank you, CAC. I would like to take a minute to recognize Cecil Pierce, one of our commissioners who I learned earlier this evening is leaving us. This is his last meeting. I want to thank him for 6 years of service and dedication to the process. And I, along with the fellow commissioners and the staff, thanks you and wishes you well.
Thank you very
Cecil.
much. I would like to sit there and say again, as I said before, thanks to all the staff and you, Steve, for all the questions that you've answered for. I mean, all the answers you've given me. And you've really helped me grow a lot and understand a lot that goes on with the planning and with the city and stuff like that. Also with the commissioners, thank you very much for everything that you've given me and all the discussions that we've had. And for the newer commissioners and the one that's going to replace me eventually, you guys are going to do great. I wish you all the best success that we could have. And that's all I got. Again, thanks very much.
Thank you, Cecil. And then a reminder that the next regular business meeting will be on June 26th. With that, no other business, meeting's adjourned.
So we throw you in the